You awaken slowly, or perhaps you are simply drifting, a wisp of consciousness settling gently upon the currents of time. The air around you is cool, carrying with it the faint, ancient scent of damp earth and wood smoke, a fragrance that has clung to human dwellings for centuries. It is not the sharp, clean coolness of a modern breeze, but something deeper, richer, imbued with the dust of ages. You feel the subtle shift beneath you, a firmness that yields just enough, a mattress filled with dried straw or leaves, rustling faintly with each breath you take. There is no urgency in this awakening, no sudden jolt into the day. Instead, it is a slow unfurling, like a tightly furled leaf responding to the first touch of morning sun. The light that filters into this space is not the bright, electric glare you know. It is soft, diffused, a gentle gray that speaks of dawn, but a dawn unhurried and shy. It seeps through small, unglazed window openings, perhaps covered with stretched animal hide or thin cloth, softening the edges of the room. Shapes begin to emerge from the shadows, the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling, darkened with years of smoke, the uneven surface of a packed earth floor, the sturdy, simple furniture crafted from local timber. There is a profound quiet, broken only by the distant, muted sounds of a world slowly stirring. Perhaps the lowing of a cow from a nearby byre, or the faint clatter of a distant bucket, or the rustle of a mouse in the thatch above. It is a quiet that invites introspection, a stillness that hums with the presence of things unseen, a silent invitation to simply be. You are not observing this world. You are in it, feeling the textures of its air, the weight of its silence, the subtle rhythm of its awakening. Your breath comes easily, a soft rise and fall in the stillness, and for a moment, time itself seems to suspend, allowing you to settle gently into this forgotten space, this quiet past. The cool air brushes against your bare arm where the rough-spun blanket has slipped away, a tangible connection to the chill of the morning, a sensation that grounds you in this unfolding reality. There is no clock marking the seconds, only the gradual brightening of the eastern sky, a slow, patient unveiling of the day. The sounds outside remain distant, like echoes from another realm, yet they are part of this world's fabric. The soft rustle of leaves, the barely perceptible drip of condensation from the eaves. You feel the firmness of the straw beneath your head, shaping itself to your form, a simple comfort. This is a place where every sensation is amplified, where the absence of modern clamor allows for a deeper resonance with the elemental. Your awareness expands beyond the confines of the room, feeling the vast, quiet expanse of the land beyond. The sleeping fields, the winding pathways waiting for the day's first travelers. There is a sense of belonging here, not just to a place, but to a different flow of existence, where human life aligns with the unhurried pulse of nature. The lingering scent of the night, a mix of damp earth and something wild, slowly begins to yield to the fresher, sharper scent of dew and growing things. You don't try to understand it or name it. You simply let it wash over you, a silent promise of the day to come. The world you now inhabit is woven from the very earth beneath your feet and the trees that rise from it. Buildings are not grand, towering structures of glass and steel, but humble, solid forms, mostly wood and daub, or sometimes stone where it is plentiful. Their walls are thick, imperfect, bearing the marks of hands that shaped them, not machines. The thatch on the roofs is deep and shaggy, a living blanket woven from reeds or straw, providing insulation against the biting cold of winter and the heavy warmth of summer. From these roofs, the slow drip of rainwater can be heard after a shower, a gentle, rhythmic patter against the packed earth below. Smoke, a constant companion, curls from central hearths, finding its way out through a simple hole in the roof or a crude chimney, lending the air a perpetual scent of wood smoke. of warming meals, of human presence. This scent clings to everything, to clothes, to hair, to the very fabric of the dwelling. It is a comforting, pervasive aroma, signaling life and warmth. The ground underfoot is rarely smooth. Inside, it might be tamped earth, softened by rushes or woven mats, carrying the faint, earthy smell of soil and dry plant matter, subtly mixed with the lingering scent of human habitation and cooking. Outside, it is often simply mud, churned by feet and hooves, especially after rain, on hard-baked dirt in the unrelenting sun. Stones, rough and uneven, might form rudimentary pathways or the foundations of more substantial structures. Your feet feel the unevenness, the subtle give of the earth, the cool firmness of stone. There is no asphalt, no concrete, only the raw, ancient surface of the land itself, directly responsive to the seasons and the weather. Every step is an engagement with the ground, a negotiation of its natural contours. The cold dampness of early morning dew on the grass, the dry crunch of fallen leaves in autumn, the clinging mud of spring, these are immediate, unmediated sensations. Sounds here are organic, elemental. The lowing of cattle from a nearby pasture, the bleating of sheep from the common grazing lands, the distant crow of a rooster marking the passage of time without clocks. These are the pervasive background hum. The rustle of wind through tall grass or the leaves of trees, a constant, natural whisper, ever present. The splash of water drawn from a well, the creak of its pulley, the distant rhythm of a cooper hammering staves, or a blacksmith's steady clang echoing from the edge of the village. Inside, the crackle and hiss of a fire, the soft thud of kneading dough against a wooden board, the quiet murmur of voices engaged in daily tasks. There are no sudden, jarring noises, no roar of engines or blare of horns. The soundscape is fluid, alive with the subtle workings of life, punctuated by the deliberate movements of human and animal. The distant barking of a dog, the flight of a flock of birds, the gentle buzzing of bees around flowering plants. These small sounds fill the air, creating a rich tapestry of acoustic detail. Even silence here is not empty. It is filled with the presence of nature, the subtle hum of insects, the gentle sigh of the wind. Textures are immediate and honest. The rough, unplaned surface of timber, its splinters a constant reminder of its raw origins. The cool, grainy feel of stone, absorbing and radiating the day's warmth or night's chill. The dry, brittle touch of straw, crumbling slightly between your fingers. Wool, often coarse and undyed, scratches against the skin, yet provides essential warmth, its lanolin scent a reminder of its animal origin. Linen spun by hand feels softer, but still far from the refined smoothness of modern fabrics, retaining a subtle irregularities from its hand processing. Clay pots, unglazed and porous, hold water and food, their surfaces cool and slightly gritty to the touch, often smelling faintly of damp earth. Metal, when present, is usually iron, heavy and strong, often blackened by fire, its surface sometimes pitted from the blacksmith's hammer, giving it a tactile history. Your fingers learn the language of these materials, their weight, their coolness, their subtle imperfections, each touch a conversation with the tangible world. Even the feel of the rope of a well bucket, rough and frayed, speaks of repeated use and communal reliance. Natural light dictates the rhythms of the day. There is no artificial illumination to extend the hours of work or leisure beyond the sun's decree. Dawn brings a slow, creeping illumination, a gentle gray that gradually strengthens, revealing the world in a soft, muted palette. Midday sees the sun at its most intense, casting sharp shadows outside, though often muted within dwellings by thick walls and small openings, creating pools of light and deep, cool shadows. As evening approaches, the light softens, turning golden, then deepens into twilight, until only the faint glow of the moon and stars or the flicker of a fire remains. Life adapts to this ebb and flow, rising with the sun, settling with its descent. Work is done by the light of day. Evenings are for quieter tasks, for shared warmth by the hearth, for storytelling in the flickering shadows, where faces are illuminated by dancing flames, and the outside world recedes into darkness and silence. The absence of constant bright light encourages a different way of seeing, an appreciation for subtleties of illumination, for the way a single candle can transform a vast, dark space. The tools of this era are extensions of the hand and body, crafted for specific tasks, often heavy and unrefined, their surfaces smoothed by repeated contact with human skin. A wooden plow, dragged by oxen, turns the earth slowly, its blades biting into the soil with a steady, grinding sound. Hand axes split logs with sharp, percussive blows, the scent of fresh wood filling the air. Simple looms weave thread into cloth with a rhythmic clack and shuttle. Each tool carries the weight of its purpose, the history of its use etched into its worn handle, its sharpened edge. Daily rhythms are tethered to the cycles of the earth and the demands of subsistence. Planting, harvesting, tending animals, preparing food, mending clothes. These are not hobbies or occasional chores, but the very fabric of existence, demanding constant effort and attention, dictating the flow of the days and seasons. There is a deeply ingrained understanding of the interdependence between human effort and nature's bounty. Spaces are defined by function and necessity. The single-room dwelling, serving as kitchen, bedroom, and gathering place, its center always the hearth, radiating warmth and life. The byre, sheltering animals close to human warmth, their soft breathing and warmth a constant presence. The communal well, a focal point for gathering and exchange, its cool water drawn up bucket by bucket, a vital resource. The church, its stone walls cold and echoing, offering spiritual solace and a sense of order, a place of quiet contemplation and communal prayer. The fields stretching outwards, the source of life, their contours shaped by generations of labor, their colors shifting with the seasons, green in spring, golden in summer, brown and fallow in winter. There is a deep connection to the land, a dependency that is felt in every fiber of being. Existence here is raw, immediate, and utterly bound to the natural world. It is a life lived in constant dialogue with the elements, with the rhythms of growth and decay, with the simple, unchanging truths of earth and sky. Every action, every material, every sound speaks of a world deeply intertwined with its environment, where survival is a daily, tangible effort, and time is measured by the sun's passage and the turning of the seasons. The faint, earthy smell of the peat burned in some hearths, the pungent aroma of fermenting grains from a small brewery, the crisp smell of drying herbs hung from rafters, all contribute to this sensory tapestry. It's a world that demands a full engagement of the senses, a constant awareness of one's surroundings, a deep, unconscious understanding of the language of the physical world. The morning air, still cool and tasting faintly of the night's dampness, pressed against the small window opening in the bride's house. Inside, the space was already stirring, though the light that seeped in was hesitant, painting the familiar objects in shades of muted gray. It was a single room, serving every purpose, its low ceiling crisscrossed with dark, smoke-stained timbers. The air, despite the early hour, carried the accumulated sense of daily life, the lingering sweetness of old straw, the subtle tang of stored grain, a faint whisper of stale wood smoke from yesterday's fire, and now a new, almost imperceptible scent of anticipation, thin and taut, like a newly spun thread. This new scent was not a smell in itself, but an atmospheric tremor, a subtle shift in the composition of the air, a nervous electricity that only the most attuned senses might register. It hung heavy, yet invisible, permeating every corner of the small dwelling. On a simple bed, its frame of rough-hewn wood, the young woman lay, her eyes open, gazing at the patterns the dim light made on the ceiling. Her breath was shallow, almost imperceptible, a faint rise and fall of the rough linen shift on her chest. She felt the coolness of the air on her skin where the coarse linen did not cover her, a sensation that sharpened her awareness of her own body. This body, familiar in its everyday movements, now felt strangely separate, a vessel being prepared for something immense and irreversible. Her limbs were heavy, rooted to the straw mattress, yet a tremor, small and deep, resonated within her, a vibration that had little to do with cold and everything to do with the quiet thrumming of a world poised on the edge of change. Her fingers, lying still on the coarse fabric of the blanket, felt the individual fibers, the subtle imperfections of the weave. The silence around her was profound, a weighty stillness that seemed to absorb all other sound, leaving only the faint beat of her own heart. She listened to it, a rapid, insistent rhythm, like a small bird trapped within her ribs. Her mind drifted, not actively thinking, but simply observing, receiving the subtle inputs of this momentous morning. The faint dust motes, caught in the sliver of light, danced in a slow, hypnotic ballet, seemingly oblivious to the gravity of the day. Around her, other women moved with a hushed reverence. Her mother, her aunts, a few older women from the village, their faces etched with the lines of hard work and knowing, their movements deliberate and slow. Their presence filled the small room, not with chatter, but with a profound internal silence. It was a silence born of shared understanding, a quiet strength that needed no words. Their hands, gnarled and calloused from years of toil, moved with a practiced gentleness. They were preparing the body, not for adornment in the way of feasts or celebrations, but for a ritual, an ancient passage. There was a quiet solemnity in their every gesture, a sense of timeless tradition being honored. The air around them seemed to thicken with their unspoken intentions, their collective memory of countless similar mornings through generations. Their skirts brushed softly against the packed earth floor, a faint rustle that was almost imperceptible in the overall stillness. First, the water. It was brought in a wooden bucket, cool from the well, its surface reflecting the faint light from the opening, a shimmering, watery mirror. A smaller basin, crafted from polished wood, perhaps a family heirloom, was filled, and a soft linen cloth, worn smooth by countless washes, was dipped into it. The water was cool against her skin as they began, slowly, meticulously, to wash her. Every touch was respectful, almost formal, a series of gestures passed down through generations. They washed her arms, her neck, her face, her shoulders. The sensation was immediate, cleansing, and yet it felt less about cleanliness and more about a symbolic purification, a shedding of the girlhood that was almost gone. She felt the subtle drag of the wet cloth, the cool trails it left on her skin, and the fleeting warmth as her body dried in the still air. The water droplets, cold and distinct, ran down her skin, leaving a trail of goosebumps. She closed her eyes, not in sleep, but in a deeper immersion into the tactile world, letting the sensations wash over her, a quiet acceptance. The faint, metallic scent of the well water clung to her skin. Then came the clothing, not the bright, embroidered garments of a feast day, but layers of humble, familiar fabrics. The linen shift, soft against her skin, was pulled over her head, its fibers yielding gently to the movement. Then a kirtle of undyed wool, its texture rough yet warm, settling over her frame. The layers were simple, practical, designed for warmth and modesty, not for display. Each garment felt significant, a step in the methodical process of dressing for a fate she had known since childhood. Her hands, resting in her lap, felt the texture of the wool, the slight scratch against her fingers, a constant, tangible reminder of the material world. She did not help them, but remained still, allowing herself to be moved, a silent doll in their careful hands. The fabric settled heavily on her shoulders, its weight a physical manifestation of the expectations that now surrounded her. The subtle scent of stored wool, dry and earthy, filled her nostrils. The hair was next. Her long hair, usually simply braided or tied, was now to be unbound and then meticulously prepared. Strong, broad combs of bone or wood were drawn through the strands, pulling gently, untangling, smoothing. She felt the subtle tug on her scalp, a familiar sensation, yet now it held a deeper weight. The women worked in unison, their fingers weaving and shaping. It was not a frivolous act of beautification, it was a ritual of containment, of presentation. For a married woman, hair would often be covered, a sign of her new status, her modesty. As they worked, the faint scent of her own hair, clean and natural, mingled with the dry, woody smell of the combs. She felt the weight of her hair shifting, being gathered, secured. The entire process was slow, deliberate, each movement a wordless instruction, a silent blessing, a quiet transfer of knowledge and tradition from one generation to the next. The strands were carefully interwoven, pulled taut, secured with pins, each action deliberate and final. The room remained steeped in this quiet, ritualistic atmosphere. No one spoke aloud, though glances were exchanged, slight nods of understanding, a silent language passed between the women. The air itself seemed thick with unspoken thoughts, with the weight of tradition and the quiet anticipation of what was to come. The only sounds were the soft rustle of fabric, the gentle scrape of the comb through her hair, the faint shifts of weight as the women moved around her, their breathing shallow and almost synchronized. It was a feminine space, filled with a silent, collective energy, a shared understanding of this ancient passage. Her own inner world mirrored this external silence. Thoughts drifted, like motes of dust in the pale light. Fleeting images of her childhood, the familiar path to the well, the feel of the earth under her bare feet in summer, the warmth of the sun on her face during harvest. Each thought was transient, ungraspable, swept away by the slow, relentless current of the present moment. She felt the faint, cool draft from the window on her face, a small, constant reminder of the outside world, yet she remained utterly contained within the bubble of this ritual. In another part of the village, or perhaps across a narrow field, the groom's household was also stirring, though with a different energy. Here, the focus was on the external, the tangible. The father, a figure of sturdy presence, moved with a quiet authority. His world was the land, the fields stretching out under the developing light, the animals in the byre, the tools hanging in the lean-to shed. His thoughts were of yields, of weather, of the strength of the oxen, of the continuity of the lineage. Rationality guided his every decision, his every action. The marriage was a practical matter, a consolidation of resources, a strengthening of bonds between families, a perpetuation of the name. It was a necessary arrangement, a cornerstone of their existence, ensuring stability and future. The sound of his heavy boots on the packed earth floor was solid and assured, a rhythmic thud that spoke of purpose. The scent of fresh hay from the byre clung to his clothes, a smell of labor and abundance. The groom, perhaps, was less outwardly demonstrative. He might be tending to a task, feeding the animals, or sharpening a tool, his movements precise and familiar. His focus, too, would be on the practicalities of the day, on the new responsibilities that would soon settle upon his shoulders like a heavy cloak. There was no internal reverie here, no soft, almost dreamlike quality. Instead, there was a groundedness, a sense of purposeful preparation, The smells in this household might be sharper, more pungent, the earthy scent of manure from the byre, the metallic tang of iron from the smithy if one was nearby, the robust aroma of baking bread already pulling from the oven, a dense, yeasty smell that promised sustenance. He would feel the weight of the plow handle in his hands, the rough texture of the ropes, the familiar resistance of the earth as it was turned. His gaze would sweep across the fields, calculating, assessing, planning for the seasons to come. The air in his home carried a different resonance, a more outward-facing energy of work and responsibility, a sturdy foundation for the new life about to begin. The sounds here were of heavier things, the distant clang of a hammer on an anvil, the low murmur of men's voices, the creak of leather. The entire village, a cluster of dwellings nestled amongst the fields, buzzed with an unspoken anticipation. It was a low hum, not a frantic excitement, but a deep, pervasive awareness. Smoke rose from many hearths, straight and thin in the cool morning air, reaching for the pale sky. Figures moved along the paths between houses, their steps purposeful, their movements a little more deliberate than usual. Children, usually quick and boisterous, moved with a subdued curiosity, sensing the gravity of the day, their small voices hushed. The rhythmic sound of a distant hammer, the bleating of a nervous lamb, the soft chatter of birds in the thatch, all these everyday sounds took on a different quality, woven into the fabric of this special morning. Every eye seemed to turn subtly towards the two households, an invisible thread connecting them all. The scent of cooking, of roasted meats and simmering grains, began to drift on the breeze, promising a feast later in the day, a communal celebration of the new bond being forged. The air itself felt charged with a quiet energy, a collective holding of breath. Inside the bride's house, the quiet anxiety of the young woman deepened, though it remained unspoken, contained. It was not a frantic fear, but a deep-seated unease, a tremor that ran beneath the surface of her skin, a restless energy that sought no outward expression. She felt the subtle throb of her own pulse, a rapid butterfly wing against her ribs. Her awareness sharpened to the smallest physical sensations. The coarse wool of her shift against her skin, a familiar irritation that now felt heightened, almost demanding attention. The faint chill of the air on her exposed forearms. The dry, almost dusty smell of the rushes on the floor, their crispness felt keenly. The scent of her mother's hands, a scent of earth and soap and something else, something uniquely her own, a scent of safety and familiarity that was now tinged with the bittersweet knowledge of impending separation. She felt the subtle pull of the tightly braided hair, now pinned and covered with a simple linen veil, its edges soft against her cheeks. The weight of the veil, however light, felt significant, a symbolic shroud, a boundary between her old self and the person she was about to become. Her fingertips, tracing the rough texture of her own skirt, registered every thread, every knot. The world outside continued its slow, inexorable turning. The sun climbed higher, gradually dissolving the morning mist, casting longer, sharper shadows that stretched across the fields. The sounds of the village grew slightly louder, the movements more pronounced, a growing hum of human activity. Yet, within the small, hushed space of the bride's room, everything felt motionless. Time, usually a flowing river, seemed to have pooled and stagnated, stretching out into an endless present. Each breath was a distinct event, each sensation magnified. The light, now stronger, highlighted the dust motes dancing in the air, tiny specks of the world in constant, unhurried motion. Yet the stillness surrounding the young woman remained profound. She was an anchor in a quiet storm, a still point in a turning world, waiting. The air, thick with unspoken meaning, pressed in around her, a tangible presence. She could feel the subtle movements of the women around her, their quiet breathing, the weight of their gaze upon her. It was as if every fiber of her being was tuned to this singular moment, this profound, silent pause before the beginning of her new life. The faint scent of wood smoke, carried on the strengthening breeze, found its way into the room, mingling with the other, more intimate smells. It was a day of profound transition, marked not by grand pronouncements, but by quiet rituals, by the subtle shift of light and air, by the deep, internal stirrings of a young woman poised on the threshold of an unknowable future. The feeling of her pulse at her wrist was steady, a quiet drumbeat in the profound quiet. The light in the small room, which had seemed so still, slowly began to shift. It was not a sudden change, but a gradual deepening, hinting at the sun's higher ascent. A silent signal passed between the women. Their movements, already deliberate, now took on a new, quiet urgency, a gentle quickening that nevertheless maintained its ritualistic grace. The final touches were made, the adjustments of the veil, the smoothing of the wool kirtle, ensuring every fold lay just so. The bride remained passive, her body a canvas upon which the ancient customs were painted. She felt the subtle shift in the air as they moved away from her, creating a small, empty space around her, a space of profound solitude despite their presence. Then, a quiet gesture, a hand, her mother's perhaps, touched her arm, a fleeting pressure, almost imperceptible. It was a silent command, an invitation to rise. Her muscles, stiff from stillness, responded slowly. She pushed herself up, feeling the straw rustle beneath her one last time before her feet found the packed earth floor. The coldness seeped through the thin soles of her shoes, a sharp, grounding sensation. She stood, a silent figure cloaked in rough fabrics and unspoken anticipation, her gaze fixed vaguely ahead. The room, which had been her world this morning, now felt transient, a space she was about to leave behind. The familiar sense of home, wood smoke, dried herbs, the faint, comforting smell of her family, were suddenly tinged with the new, sharp scent of damp earth and crisp air that drifted in from the open doorway. Outside, the air was cooler than within the confines of the dwelling, carrying the fresh scent of the fields, of dew on grass, and the earthy aroma of the churned pathways. The sky, a vast, pale expanse, stretched above the village, its light growing steadily stronger. A small procession began to form. It was not grand or boisterous, but quiet, almost somber. The women who had prepared her now surrounded her, their presence a soft, protective wall. Their footsteps, muffled by the soft earth of the path, created a gentle, rhythmic sound, a quiet drumbeat marking their slow progress. She felt the subtle unevenness of the ground beneath her feet, the occasional small stone pressing against the sole, a physical reminder of the unyielding world. The path wound its way through the cluster of dwellings, past small garden plots where vegetables were beginning to show their first green shoots, past the low, dark shapes of animal byres. The sounds of the village, which had been a distant hum, now grew subtly clearer. The distant clatter of a wooden pail, the low murmur of voices, the occasional bleat of a sheep. But these sounds remained muted, almost respectful of the solemnity of the occasion. Eyes followed their progress from doorways, from windows, from the edges of fields. No one called out, no one cheered. It was a shared observation, a quiet acknowledgement of the unfolding ritual that touched every life in the community. The air, though crisp, felt thick with unspoken expectation, a collective holding of breath. As they moved, the buildings of the village slowly gave way to more open ground. The fields stretched out on either side, vast expanses of brown earth, freshly turned, awaiting the spring planting. The smell of the turned earth, rich and primal, rose to meet them. The wind, a gentle presence, stirred the loose strands of hair around her face. Beneath the veil, a soft caress that felt both comforting and exposing. The light, unimpeded by buildings, now fell fully upon them, illuminating the rough textures of their clothing, the faint dust motes dancing in the air around them. The shadows, once long and sharp, were beginning to shorten, drawing inwards as the sun climbed higher. In the distance, rising from the gentle swell of a small hill, the church began to emerge more clearly. It was a sturdy, unadorned structure, built of gray stone, its walls thick and imposing. Unlike the softer, more organic forms of the village dwellings, the church stood as a declaration of permanence, a fortress of faith. Its simple, rounded archways were dark apertures against the lighter stone, their shadows deep and unchanging. No elaborate carvings adorned its exterior, only the raw, honest texture of the stone itself, weathered by centuries of wind and rain. The very air around it felt different, cooler, imbued with a solemn stillness. As they drew closer, the ground beneath their feet began to shift. The soft earth of the pathway gave way to a scattering of loose stones, then to a more firmly trodden path of compacted gravel and larger, irregular flagstones leading to the church door. Each step now brought a distinct crunch, a firmer contact with the ground, a sound that resonated with the increasing formality of their journey. The air grew perceptibly colder, carrying the faint, earthy scent of damp stone, a mineral coolness that clung to the building. The sounds of the village faded behind them, replaced by a deeper quiet, broken only by their own measured footsteps and the distant call of a bird. The heavy wooden door of the church stood before them, its surface rough and worn, marked by countless hands. It was bound with bands of blackened iron, cold and solid to the touch. A faint, almost imperceptible scent of cold stone and old incense drifted from within, a breath of the sacred. The air inside, even from outside, felt different, still, heavy, and profound. No one spoke. The women paused, a silent cluster before the threshold, a moment of profound transition. Then, with a soft, creaking groan that echoed in the stillness, the heavy door was pushed open. The immediate sensation upon entering was the cold. It seeped into the very bones, a profound chill that was distinct from the outdoor air. It was the deep, unyielding cold of ancient stone, absorbing the warmth of the living world and holding it in its timeless embrace. The light inside was dim, a muted twilight that struggled to penetrate the small, high windows. It fell in narrow shafts, illuminating dust motes dancing in the frigid air, casting long, silent shadows that stretched across the uneven flagstone floor. The air itself felt thick, formal, imbued with centuries of prayers and silence. It carried the faint, dry scent of old stone, of extinguished candles, of woven mats, and a subtle metallic hint of dampness. The sounds within were swallowed. Footsteps, which had crunched outside, were now muffled by the vast, echoing space. The whisper of cloth against cloth, the soft brush of a hand, seemed absorbed by the thick stone walls, leaving only a faint, resonant impression. Every movement, every subtle sound was amplified by the deep quiet, yet simultaneously contained, prevented from fully escaping into the vastness. There was no warmth here, no inviting comfort, only the austere, formal embrace of the sacred. The structure of the church was simple, yet imposing. A long nave, flanked by massive stone pillars, stretched towards the altar at the far end. The roof overhead was a dark, vaulted expanse, disappearing into shadow. There were no pews, only the cold, hard floor for kneeling or standing. The walls, rough-hewn stone, rose directly from the floor, unadorned. A few candles, already lit, flickered weakly near the altar, their small flames casting dancing shadows that seemed to whisper secrets on the ancient stone. Their light was a fragile beacon in the immensity of the interior, their faint scent of beeswax a subtle counterpoint to the coldness. The ceremony began. It was a series of measured movements, of ritualistic gestures. The priest, a stoic figure in rough vestments, his voice low and resonant, began the formal pronouncements. His words, in the ancient tongue, were not intended to be understood in their every nuance by all present, but rather to evoke a sense of the sacred, to invoke the solemnity of the occasion. The sounds he made were deep, rhythmic, reverberating slightly in the stone space. The whispering of cloth as he moved, the faint rustle of his garments, were the only interruptions to the cadence of his voice. The bride and groom stood before the altar, or perhaps knelt, their forms small against the vastness of the stone. The groom, too, felt the pervasive cold, the stiffness in his knees as he knelt. His hands, rough from working the land, felt cold and dry. He smelled the lingering scent of old incense, a heavy, dusty fragrance that settled on the air. His focus was on the ritual, on the precise fulfillment of the expectations laid upon him. This was duty, not emotion. It was a serious undertaking, a public declaration of a new societal role, a new set of responsibilities. There was no space for personal feeling in this moment, only for the solemn execution of a prescribed order. The weight of his future, a tangible presence, pressed down upon him. For the bride, the physical sensations were magnified by the quiet formality. The cold air brushed against her face beneath the veil, a constant, chilling presence. The silence was absolute, a profound quiet that pressed in on her ears, making the faint throb of her own heartbeat seem loud. Her feet, still feeling the lingering cold of the packed earth, now registered the unyielding hardness of the stone floor. It was a physical discomfort, subtle yet persistent, a constant reminder of the ceremony's austerity. The rough wool of her kirtle chafed slightly against her skin, an accustomed sensation, yet now it was more pronounced, drawing her awareness to her physical self. When the moment came for contact, it was brief, formal, perhaps the joining of hands, the priest's rough hand placing one upon the other, a symbolic binding. The skin of the groom's hand would feel dry, perhaps calloused against hers. There was no warmth, no tenderness in the touch, and only the cool, firm contact of two individuals being formally joined. It was a practical gesture, a completion of the symbolic union, a tangible affirmation of the contract. The air around them remained still, heavy. Then came the spoken vows. They were not declarations of love or personal affection, but precise, formal contracts. Words of obligation, of fidelity, of mutual support within the defined roles of husband and wife. The groom's voice, when he spoke, was low, perhaps a little rough, but clear. He articulated the ancient phrases, each syllable a brick in the foundation of their new life together. The bride's voice, when her turn came, was softer, perhaps barely audible in the vastness of the church, but equally clear in its assent. These words were not born of joy or passion, but of duty, of societal expectation, of the unbreakable bond of a legal and spiritual agreement. They were heard by the witnesses, by the priest, by the silent, ancient stone walls. They were irreversible. There was no celebration within the church walls. No music swelled, no joyous cries echoed. The completion of the vows simply marked the fulfillment of expectation. It was a somber, weighty moment, a culmination of the long preparation, but not an unleashing of revelry. The atmosphere remained formal, imbued with the sacred, with the deep, cold presence of centuries of similar unions, of similar duties performed. The priest made the final pronouncements, his voice fading into the vastness of the nave. A final blessing, a gesture, and then the quiet stillness returned, settling over them like a shroud. The faint scent of beeswax from the struggling candles, the damp mineral smell of the stone, the profound silence that seemed to hum with unseen forces. These were the only witnesses to the finality of the moment. The light, still dim, began to shift subtly, indicating the slow passage of time. The duty was fulfilled. The contract was sealed. What lay beyond these walls, outside this solemn stillness, was yet to unfold. The air within the church remained heavy with the scent of cold stone and extinguished candles, a profound stillness settling after the final low pronouncements. The bride and groom stood for a moment longer, small figures absorbed by the vastness of the space, their forms silhouetted against the dim light filtering through the high windows. There was no sudden movement, no immediate release. The silence stretched, a thick, palpable presence. Then a subtle signal, a gesture from the priest, indicated the time to depart. Their steps, once again, echoed faintly on the flagstone floor as they turned, moving slowly toward the heavy wooden door. The coldness of the stone clung to their garments, a lingering reminder of the ceremony's austerity. Outside, the light had intensified. The pale, diffused glow of early morning had given way to the brighter, sharper illumination of midday. The sun, now higher in the sky, cast shorter, more defined shadows. The air, though still cool, felt lighter, less heavy than the air within the church. The sense of the outside world, of damp earth and growing things, returned, fresh and immediate after the confined, mineral air of the sacred space. A gentle breeze, almost imperceptible, stirred the rough fabric of their clothing. The path back to the village was the same, yet it felt subtly different. The ground beneath their feet, the familiar unevenness of earth and stone, now carried a new significance. They moved in a quiet procession, the women once again forming a soft, protective presence around the bride. The hum of the village, which had been distant before the ceremony, now began to draw closer, growing in intensity. It was no longer the quiet anticipation of the morning, but a swelling murmur, a growing warmth that spoke of gathering and communal activity. As they approached the village heart, the sounds became distinct. Not the sharp individual sounds of single tasks, but a collective roar. It was a dense, overlapping tapestry of human voices, of laughter, of music, of the clatter of wood and earthenware. The air, which had been clean and crisp, now grew thick with a multitude of new smells, the rich, earthy aroma of roasting meat, mingling with the sour tang of spilled ale, the sweet stickiness of fruit, and the pervasive scent of many bodies, of sweat and unwashed wool and lingering wood smoke from countless hearths. This was the wedding feast, and it was a sensory explosion. The crowd pressed in, a living wall of bodies. It was a crowded, loud, and bodily space. Hands reached out, not to touch or embrace, but in gestures of greeting, of camaraderie. Faces, flushed with drink and excitement, turned towards the newly joined couple, their eyes bright, their mouths curved in wide-open smiles. Voices rose and fell, overlapping in a chaotic symphony of celebration. The air, already heavy with smells, was now thick with the warmth generated by so many bodies pressed close together. It was a humid, almost suffocating heat, intensified by the cooking fires that sent plumes of smoke curling upwards, mingling with the steam from hot food. The feasting took place in the largest common space of the village, perhaps a large hall or simply the central open area, where temporary tables had been set up on rough trestles. These tables, made of unplaned planks of wood, groaned under the weight of the food. Coarse food was laid out in abundance, large joints of roasted meat, their surfaces glistening with fat, dark bread loaves with thick, uneven crusts, bowls of boiled grains and root vegetables, and wooden trenchers piled high with cheese and dried fruit. Hands reached, tore, and dipped. Food was consumed with robust appetite. The sounds of chewing, of tearing meat, of slurping liquids were constant and unrestrained. Ale, in wooden tankards and pottery jugs, flowed freely. It was a dark, heavy liquid, its surface often flecked with foam. Spilled ale, thick and sticky, stained the rough wooden tables and dripped onto the packed earth floor, mingling its sour smell with all the others. Feet shuffled and scraped on the ground, sometimes slipping in the slick patches. The very air vibrated with the energy of the feast. It was a sensory assault, overwhelming and immediate. Amidst this boisterous celebration, the bride and groom sat at a central table, their presence required, yet their demeanor quiet, almost distant. They were anchors in a swirling sea of festivity, observed by all, yet seemingly observing little. The bride felt the warmth of the crowded bodies pressing in around her, the rough touch of wool against her arm as someone leaned too close. The overwhelming noise was a physical presence, a constant pressure against her ears, making individual voices indistinct, a roaring hum that vibrated through her bones. The smells were potent, the greasy richness of roasted meat, the heavy sweetness of honey, the acrid tang of sweat from dancing bodies, the sharp, almost painful scent of cheap, strong ale. She might take a bite of the food offered, feeling the rough texture of the bread, the yielding softness of the cooked meat, but the act of eating felt mechanical, detached. Her eyes, though open, seemed to see through the immediate scene, gazing inward. The groom, too, felt the heat, the press of bodies, the relentless noise. He might nod in acknowledgement to a greeting, lift his tankard in a silent toast, but his movements were reserved, his expression unreadable. He tasted the coarse food, the strong ale, his senses overwhelmed by the sheer abundance and raw energy. The smoke from the hearths, which had seemed comforting in the quiet of his own home, now felt thick and heavy in this crowded space, stinging his eyes subtly. He could feel the fine layer of sweat forming on his brow, the warmth of his clothes clinging to his skin. He was present, physically, a central figure in the communal outpouring, yet his mind remained in a private space, separate from the clamor. His hands, resting on the rough table, felt the vibrations of the feast, the rhythmic thud of feet, the occasional clang of undropped utensil. The space was hot and overwhelming. Torches, fixed to the walls or held by eager hands, added their smoky light to the flickering glow of the central fires, casting restless, dancing shadows that distorted the faces of the revelers. The air shimmered with heat and movement. Guests celebrated loudly, their voices raised in shouts and songs, their laughter booming. They gestured wildly, their movements expansive and uninhibited. Cups were refilled. Food was passed, stories were exchanged with boisterous enthusiasm. Yet, through it all, the couple remained internal. They were seen, they were acknowledged, they were the reason for the celebration, but they did not partake in the same outward expression of joy. Their stillness was a counterpoint to the surrounding chaos, a quiet center in a riotous world. Their gazes, when they met, were fleeting, unreadable, without overt emotion. As the hours passed, the light outside began to soften. The sharp intensity of midday slowly mellowed, turning golden, then deepening into the warmer hues of twilight. Inside the feasting hall, or the open space, the transition was more abrupt. As the natural light faded, the torchlight became dominant, casting deeper shadows, creating a more confined, intense atmosphere. The air grew even thicker with the accumulated smells of the day, the scent of smoke and spilled drink and human warmth intensifying as the night drew in. The celebration continued, if anything, growing louder, more unrestrained as the darkness outside encouraged a loosening of inhibitions. But with the arrival of night, another rhythm began to assert itself. There were ritual expectations that had to be met. The boisterous energy of the feast, though still vibrant, subtly shifted. A sense of anticipation, different from the morning's quiet anxiety, began to filter through the crowd. This was not the general, communal anticipation, but a more focused, almost conspiratorial energy, directed entirely at the bride and groom. Tiredness, a profound physical fatigue began to settle upon the couple. The weight of the day, the long hours of preparation, the solemnity of the church, the overwhelming intensity of the feast, all pressed down. Their movements became slower, their responses more delayed. The transition to the first wedding night was not a private affair. It was, like everything else, a communal passage marked by ancient customs. The couple would be led from the noisy, crowded feast by the assembled guests, perhaps with playful shouts, but always with an underlying adherence to ritual. The journey from the warmth and clamor of the feast to the designated sleeping space, perhaps a small room within the groom's dwelling or a specially prepared corner, was itself a part of the ceremony. The air they moved through was heavy with the lingering smells of the feast, but also with the cool touch of the night air. The chosen space, usually small and simple, would be dimly lit, perhaps by a single lamp or a few glowing embers in a small hearth. The sounds of the retreating crowd would slowly fade, replaced by a profound and sudden silence. This silence was different from the church's sacred stillness. It was a heavy, expectant silence, filled with unspoken things. The air, though warmer than the church, was cool compared to the feasting hall. It carried the faint, familiar scent of dry straw, of old wood, of the ingrained presence of human habitation. In this quiet, dimly lit space, the tension was palpable. It was not a tension of fear, but of anticipation, of profound change. The bride, perhaps seated on the edge of the simple bed, felt the roughness of the blankets beneath her fingers. Her body, weary from the long day, felt strangely heavy, yet acutely aware of its own presence. The groom, moving slowly in the confined space, would feel the quiet weight of the moment. There was no conversation, no words exchanged. The presence of the witnesses, though perhaps hidden behind a screen or in the next room, was a palpable one, their quiet breathing an almost imperceptible presence. The atmosphere was one of observation. Not direct, intrusive staring, but a felt presence, an awareness that the ritual continued, that the final, private act of the marriage was also, in its own way, a fulfillment of communal expectation. Every rustle of cloth, every subtle shift of weight seemed magnified in the deep quiet. The faint scent of wood smoke, so pervasive throughout the day, still clung to their clothes, a last link to the communal world they had just left. The darkness pressed in from the small window, absolute and still. Fatigue was a heavy cloak. The day had been long, a relentless progression of ceremonies of being observed, of fulfilling roles. The bride's eyes might feel heavy, her limbs a profound weariness. The groom, too, felt the deep ache of physical exertion, the mental exhaustion of the relentless public gaze. Yet, within this fatigue, there was a quiet, almost resigned acceptance. This was the final stage of the day's long journey, the last threshold to cross. The silence stretched, filled only by the slow, steady rhythm of their own breathing and the subtle, almost imperceptible hum of the ancient dwelling around them, absorbing the final, quiet moments of this momentous day. The outside world had retreated completely, leaving only the profound, enclosed quiet of the room and the palpable, unspoken weight of expectation. The heavy, expectant silence of the wedding night slowly yielded to the first faint stirrings of dawn. The air, thick with unspoken anticipation, gradually thinned, taking on the cooler, crisper quality of the breaking day. Within the small, dimly lit space, the shapes of the room began to emerge from the deeper shadows, visible once more. A single, weak light might have been left to burn low, perhaps a small oil lamp near the hearth, its flickering flame now paling in the face of the encroaching light from outside. The faint scent of lamp oil mingled with the lingering, almost stale aroma of wood smoke and the faint, specific smell of human presence, of sleep and unwashed linens. The morning after the wedding did not announce itself with fanfare or dramatic revelation. It arrived quietly, inexorably, as all mornings did. The subtle shift from dark to pale gray at the small window opening was the only signal. A profound weariness clung to the couple, a deep physical and emotional exhaustion that settled in the limbs and behind the eyes. The bride might stir first, a slow, almost imperceptible movement beneath the rough blankets. Her body, still heavy with the day and night before, felt the cold of the morning air against any exposed skin. The straw beneath her, which had felt so firm and unyielding the previous morning, now seemed to have softened slightly, conforming to the contours of her body. The routine of the day began to assert its ancient claim. There was no lingering, no extended rest. The demands of existence, unyielding and constant, pulled at them. The first sounds were soft, internal, the rustle of straw as one shifted, the faint creak of the simple bed frame, the slow, deliberate intake of breath. The air in the room remained heavy with the quiet memory of the night. The act of washing, a daily ritual, now took on a new, understated significance. Water, cool from the well, brought in a wooden bucket, its sound a soft splash as it was poured into a basin. The feel of the cold water on the skin, the simple drag of a linen cloth, was immediate, grounding. It was a cleansing, not just of the body, but of the lingering remnants of the night's unique tension. The groom might wash first, his movements stiff, his hands working the coarse soap. The bride would follow, her gestures perhaps a little more hesitant, a quiet acceptance of the new order. The water, running down her arms, felt cold and purifying. The subtle scent of damp earth and clean water began to replace the heavier odors of the night. The dressing was equally quiet, equally mundane. Layers of rough-spun linen and wool were drawn on, familiar textures against skin. Each garment was a return to the ordinary, a re-enveloping in the customary attire of daily life. The hair, perhaps still a little tangled from the night, would be combed slowly, meticulously, then bound or braided into its usual simple style. There was no adornment, no special garment for this morning. This was a day like any other in its outward appearance. The house itself, a humble dwelling of wood and daub, resumed its familiar sounds. The low crackle of a newly stoked fire in the hearth, its smoke curling upwards, releasing the comforting scent of burning wood. The soft clatter of earthenware bowls being moved, the rhythmic thud of a pestle in a mortar. These were the sounds of life returning to its established rhythms, a quiet declaration that the extraordinary moments of yesterday had receded, replaced by the enduring flow of the mundane. As the couple moved through these familiar motions, their subtle observations of their surroundings were heightened, yet unspoken. The light, now fully present, illuminated every familiar detail. The rough grain of the wooden table, the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams, the faint cracks in the earthen floor. Everything was the same, yet everything felt different. The air, the textures, the sounds, they carried a new weight, a quiet resonance. The shared space, once simply a dwelling, was now charged with a new, unspoken meaning. Their glances, if they met, were fleeting, indirect, holding a quiet recognition of the shared passage. There was a profound silence between them, not an empty void, but a rich, heavy quiet, filled with the unspoken events of the night, the weight of newness. Beyond the walls of their dwelling, the village was also awakening. The first light of dawn brought forth the familiar sounds of animals stirring, the lowing of cattle, the bleating of sheep, the sharp crow of a rooster from a distant coop. Smoke began to rise from other chimneys, thin tendrils curling into the cool morning air. Figures moved along the pathways, muffled by the early hour, engaged in the ceaseless routines of life. Yet a subtle difference permeated the village air. It was a quieter morning than usual, a morning filled with quiet voices, whispers behind doors. Neighbors, emerging from their own homes, performed their morning tasks with a heightened awareness. Their eyes, though seemingly focused on fetching water from the well or tending to their animals, would subtly linger on the newly married couple's dwelling. There would be no direct gaze, no overt curiosity, but a quiet, almost imperceptible observation. A sense of shared experience, of communal memory, hummed beneath the surface of the morning. Reflections from neighbors and elders would weave through the quiet atmosphere of the village. An elder woman, her hands gnarled from a lifetime of labor, might pause by her hearth, her gaze distant, remembering her own wedding day, the solemnity of the church, the boisterous feast, the quiet, expectant darkness of her own first night. Fragments of the past would surface. The feel of rough wool, the scent of fresh straw, the chill of stone. She would remember the profound sense of transition, the weight of new responsibilities settling upon her shoulders. Her thoughts would not be explicit judgments or analyses, but a silent reliving of sensory memories, a recognition of the timeless cycle. A neighbor, mending a fishing net by his doorway, might recall other weddings he had witnessed, the faces of other brides and grooms, their expressions mirroring the quiet solemnity he imagined within the newlyweds' home. He might remember the feeling of the shared feast, the communal release of laughter and drink, and the subsequent quiet that settled over the village the morning after. These were not intellectual reflections, but simply the slow, gentle unfolding of memories of other weddings, fragments of the past, held within the quiet spaces of the mind. Each memory was a thread, weaving into the larger tapestry of communal life, connecting the present moment to the unbroken chain of generations. The air seemed to carry the faint echoes of these past moments, a subtle resonance that only the attentive could feel. Within the couple's dwelling, the movements continued, stoking the fire, preparing a simple meal of porridge or coarse bread, tending to the few household tasks. The bride might move to the hearth, feeling the radiant heat on her face, and then the chill of the unheated corners of the room. The groom might step outside for a moment, his senses taking in the familiar landscape, the subtle scent of the damp earth, the chill in the air, the vast expanse of the pale sky. In these familiar settings, nothing appeared to change, yet everything felt different. The familiar tools in their hands, the familiar sounds, the familiar tasks, all were imbued with a new, unspoken meaning. The space itself felt altered, subtly expanded, holding the weight of a new shared history. The air in the room, though clearing from the night, still retained a certain density, a silent acknowledgement of the events that had transpired. The light, growing stronger with the advancing morning, illuminated the imperfections of the walls, the roughness of the timbers, the dust that settled on every surface, details that had always been there, but now seemed to carry a deeper significance, as if witnessing their new reality. The world outside the small dwelling continued its relentless turning, marked by the slow ascent of the sun, the shifting shadows, the gradual warming of the air. But within the quiet confines of the home, a new kind of time began, stretching forward, slowly, without ceremony. To live in this world, to be a part of this unfolding, meant to exist in a profound alignment with the earth and its rhythms. The human body was not a separate entity, but deeply entwined with the materials that surrounded it. The rough wool that chafed the skin, the cold stone that chilled the bones, the damp earth that clung to the feet. Every touch, every scent, every sound was a direct communication with the raw, elemental world. There was little abstraction. Life was experienced in its immediate sensory fullness. The scratch of wool, the tang of smoke, the heavy quiet of the church, the dense clamor of the feast, These were not merely observations, but integral parts of being, shaping the very consciousness of those who lived them. What did it mean to live like this? It meant understanding time not as a series of ticking seconds, but as a deep, patient breath. The day was measured by the sun's journey across the sky, by the slow warming of the air, by the shadows lengthening and shortening. The year was marked by the turning of the seasons, by the cycles of planting and harvest, by the birth and death of animals. There was a profound, almost unconscious patience woven into the fabric of existence. Nothing rushed. Even momentous events, like a wedding, unfolded with a deliberate slowness, each stage a measured step in a long, ritualistic journey. To live like this was to know the constant presence of community. Individual lives were not lived in isolation, but interwoven with the lives of others. The preparations of the bride, the gathering for the feast, the solemnity of the church, these were shared experiences, witnessed and acknowledged by all. The privacy of modern life, the separation of personal emotion from public display, was largely unknown. Even the most intimate moments were held within a wider communal awareness, understood as part of a larger, collective narrative. The silent observation from neighbors, the whispers behind doors, were not intrusive in a modern sense, but a natural expression of this deep interconnection. It meant existing in a world where duty and expectation often superseded individual emotion. The marriage was not primarily a union of hearts, but a contract, a societal necessity, a continuation of lineage and land. Joy, if it came, was a quiet, private bloom, not a boisterous declaration. The outward expressions were of solemnity, of adherence to ritual, of fulfilling a preordained path. The deep internal life, the unspoken feelings, remained largely unseen, held within the quiet confines of the individual soul. The weight of this expectation, heavy and pervasive, shaped gestures, expressions, and the very rhythm of daily existence. What did it mean to exist in a world where knowledge was not abstract, but embodied? Where history was not read from books, but felt in the texture of an ancient wall, heard in the creak of a familiar tool, seen in the lines on an elder's face? It meant that wisdom was passed through observation, through quiet doing, through shared presence. The why was less important than the how. The significance of an event, a gesture, a ritual, emerged not from intellectual analysis, but from its deep resonance within the body and the land, from its unbroken repetition through time. There was a profound humility in this existence. Human life was small, fragile, and utterly dependent on forces larger than itself. The weather, the fertility of the land, the health of animals. Control was limited. Acceptance was key. The rhythms of life were dictated by nature, by tradition, by the divine. There was little space for individual assertion, for breaking away from the established order. This humility was not a weakness, but a strength, a quiet understanding of one's place within a vast, interconnected web of life. To live like this was to understand that change was slow, almost imperceptible. Seasons turned, generations passed, but the fundamental patterns of life, the daily tasks, the material world, remained largely constant. The sense of progress, of rapid transformation, was alien. Instead, time felt like a deep, still pool, holding the echoes of all who had passed through it. Even a momentous event like a wedding, which profoundly altered individual lives, was, in the larger scheme, simply another ripple in this vast, slow pool, a repetition of something ancient and unending. It was a life lived within a profound awareness of the cyclical, where endings were always beginnings, and beginnings always contained the seeds of repetition. The light in the small dwelling continued its slow, silent progression. It softened now as the morning edged towards its gentle decline. The air, which had held the subtle tension of the early hours, gradually relaxed, becoming simply the air of a quiet, ordinary day. The sounds, too, receded. The faint crackle of the hearth fire, settling into a low, steady hum. The distant, muffled sounds of the village, growing fainter, melting into the general quiet. The specific smells of the morning, the newness of clean water, the freshness of stirred earth, began to blend with the deeper, ingrained sense of the home. The dry, woody aroma of ancient timbers, the faint, sweet scent of straw. The couple, having completed their quiet morning tasks, might settle into their customary places. Perhaps the woman would sit by the hearth, her hands engaged in the slow, rhythmic motion of spinning thread, the rough wool passing through her fingers, transforming under their steady work. The faint whirring of the spinning wheel would be the only sound, a gentle, hypnotic hum. Her gaze might drift to the small window, observing the subtle dance of dust motes in the slanting light, each tiny particle a silent testament to the ceaseless, imperceptible movement of the world. Her breath would be slow, deep, a quiet rise and fall of her chest, a rhythm that was now her own and subtly, yet profoundly, part of a shared existence. The man, perhaps, would be outside, engaged in some quiet task in the yard, his movement steady, unhurried. The feel of a wooden tool in his hand, worn smooth by generations of use, would be familiar, comforting. The cool touch of the earth beneath his worn boots, the texture of the rough timber of the outbuilding he might be mending. These were immediate, tangible realities. The sounds that reached him would be the soft rustle of wind through the tall grass beyond the village, the distant, muted call of a bird, the faint, almost imperceptible hum of insects in the warm air, the scent of damp earth, of drying hay, of the specific, comforting aroma of his own animals would surround him. As the day deepened and the sun began its slow arc towards the west, the light in the dwelling would begin to soften further, taking on the warm, amber hues of late afternoon. The shadows would lengthen, stretching across the packed earth floor, slowly engulfing the familiar objects in their gentle embrace. The air, which had held the freshness of morning, would now carry the faint, diffused warmth of the afternoon, perhaps touched by the scent of baking bread from a distant oven or the faint, sweet smell of blossoming plants. The sounds of the village would slowly begin to dim as the light faded. The earlier activity would lessen, replaced by a quiet, winding down, a gathering inward. Figures would move back to their dwellings, seeking the warmth and comfort of the hearth. The smoke from the chimneys would grow thicker, rising straight and steady into the twilight sky. The world outside would slowly become absorbed by the deepening dusk, its outlines softening, its sounds becoming muted until only the most immediate, intimate sounds remained. Within the dwelling, the candlelight would be lit, a small, fragile flame against the encroaching darkness. Its soft, dancing glow would cast long, wavering shadows on the rough walls, making the familiar space feel both intimate and vast. The scent of beeswax, faint and pure, would fill the air. The couple would sit by the hearth, the warmth of the fire a tangible presence, its low crackle a constant, comforting sound. Their faces, illuminated by the flickering light, would be soft, their expressions unreadable in the shifting shadows. The final impression is one of timelessness, not a sense of time standing still, but of time flowing so deeply, so slowly, that its movement is almost imperceptible. The past is not gone. It is held in the fibers of the wool, in the grain of the wood, in the coldness of the stone, in the rhythm of the breath itself. The future is not a defined destination, but an endless, unceremonious stretching forward, a repetition of seasons, of routines, of quiet moments. The story fades now, like smoke rising from a hearth, dispersing into the vast, silent expanse of the sky. It does not conclude. It does not resolve. It simply dissolves, leaving only the lingering scent of wood smoke, the subtle echo of footsteps on packed earth, the quiet hum of existence. The images soften, the sounds become faint whispers, the sensations blur until they are no longer distinct, but simply a part of the air itself, a gentle vanishing into the forgotten past, leaving only a lingering resonance, a sense of having been there, quietly, for a moment, in the slow, unending flow of time.